Okay, well today we're going to be covering the crucifixion. That is our topic for today, and as I said, I think the crucifixion is the most important part of our class. Not simply because it brings in the most data or anything like that, but I think the crucifixion is really where we derive our meaning to our faith, but also there's quite a lot of data that really brings our faith down to the ground. It's where the rubber really meets the road. And so as we take a good look at the cross, I think it makes our faith a lot more real to us than we realize. As we go throughout our lives, as we speak to people, even people who are not of the good sorts, you might see like a gang member or something wearing a cross, or you might see a girl lavishly clothed wearing a cross, and you might ask her, what does that mean to you? And it means nothing. Or the gang member, it's just more of a cultural thing than it is a meaning thing. And so what I find is, don't worry, I just started a little bit early. What I find is that we take the cross for granted in its meaning, not just in its theological meaning, but in the depth of meaning of what that cross really signifies and the reality of what that cross really is. And so I think this class, this one in particular, is a very sobering reminder of what the crucifixion is, what that data entails, and how that in turn reflects onto our theology and our relationship with God. Now, the data on the crucifixion is plentiful. I mean, this data is going to be one which we're not really arguing with people about. We're all pretty much in a consensus. And so Bart Ehrman rightly says that Jesus died by crucifixion is almost universally attested in our sources, both early and late. Completely right. I mean, as we look at some of these sources, and some of them we already have in last week as we went over the non-Christian sources, one of them we keep appealing to, Josephus. He says when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the men among us, condemned him to the cross. So we have the crucifixion right there, according to Josephus. Tacitus appeals to this as well. He says in his long form, and we can kind of extract the conclusion from this, he says, "And punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty, a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians, Christus the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. And the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but the capital itself, where all things horrible and shameful in the world collect and find vogue. First, then, the confessed members of the sect were arrested, and I do have these highlighted because these are the ones that we're going to be looking at and assessing here. So they're arrested, and then on their disclosures, the vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the count of as for the hatred of the human race, not so much for on the account of, as much as for the hatred of the human race. A derision accompanied their end, and they were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs. Or they were fastened to crosses, and when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night. What we see here is that Tacitus styles these as a most exquisite tortures. That's the way he chooses to articulate it. And what we see is three different kinds of tortures that are available to us that apparently Christians undergo. And apparently, Christus fell under the one who was most tortured. So we see they're either covered with skins of animals and being torn up by dogs. You can kind of see the illustration here. They were nailed to crosses, or they were doomed to flames. Now I separated those because I'm not too sure if the nailing to crosses always accompanied by nighttime set on fire, or if there is a difference between, being doomed to the flames by nighttime or simply nailed to a cross. But it could just be two punishments, either torn up or nailed to crosses. As we further examine this, we see that, once again, I pointed this out already, Christus, whom the origin derives its name, suffered extreme penalty. And we note that some of these most quote-unquote exquisite tortures are listed, one of them being crucifixion. I think given the historical data, Christ being flogged, beaten, mocked, crown of thorns, publicly humiliated, and finally crucified, I think in light of the eyewitness data, we can clearly say that he fits the criteria as a man who suffered the extreme penalty. So this is what I think Tacitus is affirming, and yes, affirming his crucifixion. Lucian of Samosata, we talked about him as the satirist. He says Christians whom they still worship the man who was crucified in Palestine, and then finally there at the bottom, transgress all by denying the Greek gods and by worshiping that crucified sophist. So there's not really like an argument against what took place. This is a consensus. And finally, we did the honorable mention of the Babylonian Talmud. Here it says, on the eve of the Passover, Yeshu was hanged. And finally there at the bottom again, it says in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. That hanged serves as a euphemism. The euphemism for his crucifixion. Let's remember that Paul himself is the one that says that Jesus hanged on the tree. This is a euphemism for the crucifixion. It's a way that you can talk about crucifixion without saying crucifixion. And we use that as well. I guess I can say hanging from the gallows instead of like proper, the person was hanged. There's euphemisms we have for executions. So the Babylonian Talmud does also corroborate the crucifixion. Now, when we count the independent sources, we see we're in the plethora. Mark, Matthew, Luke, Q. As we remember, that's Mark and Luke. Matthew and Luke to the exclusion of Mark. John, he's always considered independent. And then we have Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian in the Babylonian Talmud. Now, mind you, this isn't even all of them. This is just what I just threw in front of you right now. There's actually more to it than just this. You have early Christian sources such as, probably people like Polycarp, Ignatius, Justin Martyr, people like him that come very early, also corroborating the death and crucifixion of Jesus. So this is just literally what we just went over, and we can see we're in very good standing. So right there, multiple attestation by a long shot. When it comes to the eyewitness sources, we have these as well for being flogged, beaten, mocked, crown of thorns, publicly humiliated, and crucified. You can see just off the list, you got about 2 or 3 sources to each one. Like I said, remembering John is always an independent source. But like I said, that's not even extensive either. That's just me putting together these slides in the time that I have. And so I don't always list every single verse. Paul Mayer says Many facts from antiquity rest on just one ancient source, while 2 or 3 sources in agreement generally render the fact unimpeachable. Palmer notes that so much of our history rests on just one source. 2 or 3 sources in agreement within ancient historical sources pretty much solidify that fact. And here, as we're talking about the crucifixion, death, and the details surrounding this, I mean, we're talking about how many sources, and I'm just doing off the top of my head. Like, this is great. Can you close that door? So this is really, really great data. Now, before we really dive into the crucifixion, and I would like to end in a timely manner, so I am trying to get ahead. In this class, the reason why we titled this class The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus and not The Case for Christ is because we're building from the ground up. We are doing a historical inquiry to who this man, Jesus of Nazareth, is. To the contrary of the Jesus mythicists, he is really someone who existed. The question is, like George Washington really existed. The question is, like, how much became myth or things like that, And that's where we're building this case. Not simply at the conclusion, but starting from, let's start with the guy that exists and move to the facts. And so we must remind ourselves that who we're talking about is a man who was born, a man who existed, a man who grew up. And we have this in the early data too. He was born Matthew 1:19 through 25. We got Luke 2:7. He grew up. He had a childhood. I'm sure he fell. I'm sure he cut his knee when he was playing. But when he gets to his 30s and he starts his ministry and the accounts actually pick up and follow his life for those 3 years, we see the corroboration of him being a man. He gets hungry. In Matthew 4:2, we have Matthew 21:18 and Mark 11:12. These are all instances in which Jesus says he's hungry. He fasts for 40 days to be tempted, and it says at the end of it, he was hungry. He eats with his disciples. It's a person who gets hungry. It's a person that also gets angry. Don't we all? We see him cleanse the temples at the injustice. We see him be dismayed at the stubbornness of the Pharisees. We see him get frustrated with his disciples who, though he just taught them, cannot seem to get it together. And even when he's warning them, hey, be careful of the leaven of the Pharisees. His disciples are like, oh, he must be talking about the bread that we didn't have. No. No. Guys, focus up, lock in, all right? That's not what I'm talking about. So he gets frustrated, he gets angry, he gets tired. We see in John 4:6 and Matthew 8:23 through 27, he sleeps. At one point, he's so exhausted from going about the day, going throughout the town, teaching, being touched and pushed and shoved and grabbed and pulled all day long. People bringing their sick to him praying over them, healing. All of these things taking place all day, going from one place to another and teaching them, and then teaching his disciples privately in all these things. And finally, he gets the opportunity as they get into the boat to ship across to the other side And who knows, he maybe has 30 minutes or an hour, however long this row's going to take. And he falls asleep and naps in deeply because a storm comes and it's coming hard. So hard that everyone thinks that they're going to perish. And so they wake him up and he has to calm the storm and say, like, dude, what's going on with you guys? I mean, an entire day, you see me making the blind see, the lame walk, the entire day, and I get 30 minutes to nap here, and you wake me up? He's tired. He gets tired. He gets disappointed. He gets disappointed in the Pharisees and even in his disciples. This one in particular, Philip says, hey, Jesus, show us the Father. And she says, Philip, you've been with me all this time, and you ask me to show you the Father? I mean, you have been seeing the work right in front of you. I am his image. And so he gets disappointed in Philip at the question, because standing before him is the Father's image, the work. And then also he cries. John 11:35, if you want to begin memorizing scripture, let me exhort you by starting with John 11:35. Remembering the reference is as much as the reference itself. Jesus wept. Jesus comes to the funeral of Lazarus, who is dead. And upon seeing, he sees everyone crying and wailing over Lazarus and having lost him. And he's so moved by them. He's so moved at this funeral because he's just about to resurrect him. You would think you would show up and be like, guys, chill out, watch this. But he's so moved by people's mourning, people's heartbreak, their anguish. And I think part of me thinks that as he stares at this, as the incarnate God he is, goes, this is not what I made this creation to be. It was meant to be good, and it was never meant to encounter death. They were never meant to experience suffering. They were never meant to experience mourning. They were never meant to experience what they do. And I think he becomes overcome with the scene of what's taking place. That God actually enters into our misery. He enters into our situation and circumstance that we're in and takes the time to relate and empathize with us. Because remember, Jesus is about to raise him. He doesn't need to weep. And yet he sits in the situation with them and is moved by and weeps at the funeral, then goes and raises Lazarus. So he is someone who also mourns and weeps. He can cry. And let's remember that when we decide to, form what we think is of what it is to be a man, right? Men don't cry. To the contrary, we do. So as we look at the picture of Jesus, what we see is someone who is just so human. I also think this is why, and I said this last week, the apostles miss it so deeply. Here they are walking with a man who they joke with. They've seen him on bad hair days. They've seen him trip. They've seen him joke. They've seen him get angry. They've seen him get mad. They've seen him get sad. They've seen him eat. And they've seen him had to walk somewhere after he eats. There's someone who has experienced another man, a real person, a real human being, just like you and me, which is important to remember as we're building from the ground up on Jesus of Nazareth, so that we can really remind ourselves that this is not simply letters on a page or a character in a book, but a person who left footprints. And when he was cut, left blood. It's to that where I'll turn us to the Shroud of Turin for just a brief moment. And in this course, this week, in fact, we have the opportunity to cover the Shroud of Turin, and I'll say we won't. We don't have the time. If you'd like, I'll try and shoehorn it in maybe next week. I'll get maybe a hand vote at the end of this class. It is really good data. In fact, it was an obsession of mine for a brief moment when I took a class with some of the experts of the Shroud. But what I'm going to do right now is use the Shroud of Turin to become the bones of our conversation, rather than the conversation we're having. So a brief description of the Shroud: it's a full-length cloth. I mean, it's very long because it encapsulates all of a body. And it takes up both the front and the back. This cloth goes from the heel and it comes all the way along the back. And then when they laid the person on it, they folded it over, hot dog style, and it comes all the way through the front and then back over the legs. And so you have a dual image of full body, front and back, along this long piece of cloth. Now, one thing about this cloth, it's an accurate description of crucifixion and flogging, particularly in a first century environment. So this is why I'm going to use it as our structure for this class. So what we'll do is we'll start at the head of the man in the shroud, and then we will move our way down. Let's start at the head. Now, as we look at the man in the shroud, who seems to be a first century Jew who has undergone crucifixion. I put first century in quotations because that's a whole conversation in and of itself. It could be mid-1500s or something like that. But what we see in the man in the shroud is that he had some sort of a head wound, and you can see the back right there, certain marks, in conjunction with what would have been a crown of thorns. We see markings in the upper part of the head as well, which is really interesting because it gives us a conversation piece as to when we think about the crown of thorns, do we think about the wreath that circles around like modern day kings, or do we think about the cap, as you see in that image on the right, which is a bit more popular in the ancient Near Eastern kings, which would probably be a little bit more like that image on the bottom left that might have been put together. It's a cap rather than a wreath. What we see, according to the man in the shroud, is he had something that was akin more to that cap, that would have been more in line with the ancient Near Eastern crowns, as opposed to, what becomes stylized made a little bit later in the Middle Ages and stuff. and maybe I put maybe the wreath from the Roman times would have been it. So we have that crown of thorns there. You know what? I forgot to bring the crown of thorns. Shoot. I actually made a crown of thorns out of thorns that I came across on this path, and it looks a lot like that image. I was going to send it around for you to hold, because one of the things about holding a crown of thorns is you can't really do it without getting pricked yourself. And especially when it's new, putting this thing together, I can tell you, I don't know how many times I got pricked putting it together. And it itches too. Because thorns have that little bit of, I don't want to call it like venom or something, but things, so it pokes you. It causes a little bit of that inflammation and starts to actually itch and irritate that what you're scratching at it and stuff. But there's really no way to get away from getting pricked by this by mere holding onto. Let alone the fact that this is being impressed upon the head with these thorns cinching down on the cranium, which has these various blood vessels and pain receptors. And so it would have been really painful for the person to have that pressed onto their skull. What we also see in the man in the shroud is he has a swollen eye, almost like swollen shut. And what scholars think may have taken place to the man in the shroud, as he's most certainly a crucifixion victim, is that at some point as he was carrying his cross or carrying his patibulum, which is the horizontal beam that becomes fixed on the cross itself into something like a T later, people were made to carry their patibulum on their back and were probably strapped to it, tied. Their hands were tied to the actual beam. Now, if one falls with your hands tied to the patibulum, you don't really have your hands free to pad your fall or to keep you from falling. And so it's very likely, because of the imprints on his face, as well as some of the markings even on his back that seem to be fashioned in a different way from the rest, indicating there might have been some weight on it. When you fall on your face, you don't just fall on your face. You have all the weight of a tree trunk coming down on it too. And so it seems like the nose was flattened a bit, maybe broken, and the cheek was swollen from the fallings under the weight of the patibulum as he was made to carry it. We see this corroborated in John 19:17 when it says, "So they took Jesus and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull," in which Aramaic is called Golgotha. It is probable that he couldn't carry his cross all the way and probably did fall multiple times, because Simon of Cyrene was forced to carry the cross, and is multiply attested in both Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So this is very likely that Jesus underwent this. He did fall. He fell flat on his face, probably broke his nose flat. His face was probably pretty swollen, just from the blunt force of that as well. And Simon of Cyrene was then tasked by the Romans to carry it for him. Now, there's a couple of verses I have here that he was beaten. Luke 22:23, it says that they beat him. It says, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" John 19:1-12, it says, under his care, they struck him with his hands. Mark and Matthew actually add that it wasn't just his hands, but they were striking his head with a reed. So they might have been using like a reed or a rod to hit him over the head with, kind of make that crown of thorns sink in a little bit deeper, create that irritation. And all this is really going to show is, I mean, he was being beaten up. So his eye was swollen shut. I mean, his face was looking like, you know, Mike Tyson at the end of his years. It was a bad scene. As we move now to his back and his chest, what we see here in the indications of the negative is you'll see these various kind of lines. Those are scourge marks. Those are like open wounds. And we see these just littered throughout the body, both front and back. What we also see is there's indications, if you really look at them, particularly in the back, in which there's like sort of a round part, a little connecting part, and another round part. What we think is there's a Roman flagrum that is being used here to flog him, according to the indications of the gospel data, but probably in this barbell-like shape. As we look at Roman flagrums, we see that there's many different instruments that can be used within flogging someone. Most notably is those with sheep knuckles. And those are tied within the leather straps as well. Some of them have, in the bottom left, even hooks within them so that they could kind of dig into the shallow part of the skin and pull it up. And then there at the far right, you can see a little bit more of that barbell shape, in which that's really just supposed to dig into the upper layer of the skin. The whole point of the flogging was not to kill, but to torture. It wasn't to, dig into the person's organs. What it was meant to do was to rip up as much of the skin layer as possible. And these were the instruments that were used to do so. I mean, we see it on the man in the shroud. And a lot of this is to tear open that skin, reveal even some of the muscle fibers, and then even expose to, at some points, even the bone. Roman flogging was nothing to be winced at. It's not like, I was flogged once, it doesn't matter, I'll do it again, It's like, I don't think you ever wanted to go through it once. Now there is this idea of 40 minus 1, and this comes out of 2 Corinthians 11:24. Paul says, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1, the floggings or the lashes by the Jews. This comes from Deuteronomy 25:3, where it says, he may receive no more than 40 lashes, lest your brother be beaten any more than that and be degraded in your sight. What we see is Paul underwent the lashings 5 times by Jews. And in typical Jewish fashion, not willing to break the law, they create a system in which they avoid the breaking of the law, but is a system in and of itself, which is you are condemned to 40 lashes minus 1, which is just 39, so you don't break the law. Here's the problem with that, guys. One, Paul is being flogged or whipped by Jews, which means the Jews are held to this law. Jesus and the man in the shroud are not held to this standard. The man in the shroud bears around 120 marks on his body. The Romans are not constrained to Deuteronomy, and they're not constrained to 40 minus 1. They go as long as they feel is necessary and want. And the person in the shroud underwent a significant amount of trauma to his body, arms, back, and I think even some on the face, if I remember correctly. May have been a stray one. But I don't think that man went through the privilege of 40 minus 1. And that really brings us to the realization of as well that this is Roman flogging. This isn't whipping. This is Roman flogging. And it's brutal and it's bloody, and they were exquisite at it, if I can use Tacitus. What we can tell by the lashings is the certain areas and patterns on which they come from. You can see on the chest that they come downwards towards the sternum. In some parts they angle upwards. You can see it in various directions, particularly on the back. I forget what the significant detail is because it's been a while since I've investigated the shroud, but I think someone said that you can tell the person who flogged him was right-handed or something. Just because of the way it was implemented. Like I said, I forget. It's been a while since I've looked into the evidences. But because of that, we can see that the person who's being flogged probably is being held to, or is probably tied to something like that, and is in a position in which the person can either go up or down on kind of comfortably. It's actually this reason why I think the Passion of the Christ probably gets it a little bit more right than the depiction. I think the one that's depicted in the Passion of the Christ allows a little bit more for the variable pattern of both up and down. So I think, in my opinion, he was held or fixated in a position a little bit lower than just straight standing up, so that it can account for the person's whipping coming downward. When it comes to the front, I'm going to be honest, I think Mel Gibson's guess is probably good, of him just being in a laid down position, because I don't know how you fixate someone to a pole like that facing forward. But I could be wrong. It's just an observation and a guess of mine. But we do see that I think Mel Gibson's depiction of the flogging scene is actually very, very strikingly accurate, and I think that's what makes it so difficult to watch. In addition to this, we also see here highlighted in almost that bright white, there's a wound on the side of the man in the shroud. And it bleeds down. So this is a gaping open wound. Now, the body's response to trauma inflicted, when it undergoes significant amount of trauma, there's a phenomena in which the body goes hypovolemic, which means that the fluids in the body, because of the significant blood loss, begin to pool away and go into the tissues itself. And so there sort of becomes this system trying to counterbalance the blood loss, in which this clear fluid extracts from the body and is within the body in certain areas. But this really only comes under the prerequisite of significant trauma to the body, as well as the blood loss, which is two prerequisites we can say is certainly there for Roman flogging, especially given the long nature of the gospel data accounts of being beaten all night and all that other stuff. Well, in addition to this, in the case of the gospel witness, it is possible that the fluid might have pooled up both into the pericardium and lungs, the pericardium being a sac near the heart. And it could have pulled up also by the lungs as well. So as we look once again at the man in the shroud, we see there's an open wound within his side. But when you take a look at the chemical data of, that is, you scrape off a little bit and you assess that. Actually, what they did was tape, not scraping. What they found was there's this clear sort of fluid along with blood of the man in the shroud, which means that this person did undergo this traumatic state, and both this clear fluid and blood flowed out of the side of this man. Well, as we once again go into that phenomena, what we see is there's this sac that flows along the heart, which is that pericardium. And this pericardium effusion taking place under bodily trauma, this cardiovascular trauma, will begin to inflame and withhold this clear fluid. And so we have the pericardium being illustrated here on the left, but we also see where that excess fluid builds up there on the illustration on the right, healthy heart versus that second one where the excess fluid is building up. And so we can see that clear fluid can build up next to the heart. Let me say this real quick. This is probably one of the only quotes that I cannot fully corroborate, and to be honest, I'm still in the process of finding this primary resource and seeing whether this is true. So let's take this one with a grain of salt. But apparently there was a practice in which, in order to be granted removal from the cross, there was a practice, and that alone is very rare. You don't get taken down from a cross. You die, and you stay up there. But if someone was to be removed from the cross prematurely because they're dead and they're somehow granted access, according to this Roman writer Quintilian, which I need to track down this source, I haven't yet, they would only allow this to be done if a centurion allowed this to take place, and then just to make sure that the body the person was actually dead, there was to be the granting of a death blow to the body. In that Latin term for that death blow is something that is used for either sword, axe, or a spear. And that is to ensure that the person is dead, and if not, is dead now. When we look at the data for the gospel accounts, we do see that a granting of the removal does take place. We do see a centurion does in fact use the death blow to ensure that he's dead, and uses a spear in corroboration with the allowance of that Latin term. What we also see is, according to the trajectory of where he is being crucified, as well as the access point of the spear, it would have come upward from his side and into the heart that would have pierced that pericardium. Therefore, when the spear was removed, both blood and the pericardial fluid, that clear fluid, would have leaked out. And so the gospel witness records this as both blood and water, or this clear fluid. So what we see here is the man on the cross, or the person on the shroud, was speared through and pierced in the lung or heart itself, and certainly would have been dead. Now, when it comes to the arms, there's indication of nails in the wrists, not the palms, which would have made a lot more sense for the historical data. Various experiments have taken place using corpses, or that's not the technical term, cadavers in which their hands were pierced through for like a crucifixion replica, and it just went right through their palms. It just ripped it right open. So our conception of Jesus being nailed in the hand is just wrong. It would have been through something like his wrist or something, as we see depicted here, that would have been able to bear the weight of the body. And what we see here is the man in the shroud did, in historical fashion, he was crucified. There's the nail markings and the blood flowing as well in a historical fashion. It doesn't flow straight down, and in fact it doesn't flow directly perpendicular to his palm. You would think, like this, it would just flow kind of straight down, but rather in an even more historical fashion than those of the medieval artists, it actually flows according to both gravity and the contours of the body. And so you can see it flow diagonally down and over because of gravity and the angle of the hands. It would not have been like this, and so it would not have gone directly down, but upwards and down, so it would have flowed through and down the arm a little bit. So we see this person's blood flow a little bit following that historical reality. And as we look at the example of the Roman nails, they're nails. They go through the wrists, and they're bent at the back. We'll see a little bit of that later. So the person in the shroud was crucified. There's the palms again. The other one was actually through the wrists. But you can see the typical fashion. This is AI generated, likes to put the blood flowing directly down rather than according to the contours of the body. As we look at the feet now, we notice the wounds on the feet. And we see that there's a little bit of overlap here. They're both pierced potentially with one nail, overlapping feet. And the Roman nail went through the heel, not really the fleshy part, same reason, but rather through the actual heel of the person being crucified. Because of this, there's a couple different ways that we think someone might have been crucified. Sorry, that went the opposite way. Maybe in the way that we traditionally see it. Perfect possibility. In fact, I think that might have been it. But the second one is also another potential reason, another potential way that someone was crucified, with his legs angled in that way so that it can go through the side of the heel of the bone. Both are possibilities. And this is all according to the data that we have. The data that we have absolutely is this archaeological data of Yohanan, son of Hagol. And he is a young Jewish male, likely crucified around the 1st century during the Roman period. Now his casket was found in, when I say casket, I have to put that in quotations because it's an ossuary, which is a bone box about this size. And it's used so that when you lay your family member in a tomb, you cover up the tomb or whatever you have, and you let that body decompose for some time. And after the body has decomposed and all that's left is the bones, you go in with your ossuary, you gather up the bones, and you leave the bones in this place as sort of its urn for the rest of the time to be memorialized. And his name is carved in the side so you remember who he is. Well, as we uncover this ossuary of this young Jewish male of the 1st century, what makes this spectacular is apparently this man was crucified, and the nail along with the wood of the crucifixion was still fixed to the heel bone itself, which gave us significant insight to the practice of crucifixion and how it was done. Here we see it went right through the heel bone, which, is just, it just has all these vessels and in all these pain receptors and stuff where at these piercings, it's like the worst place it can go through is what they decided. And so when it comes to the data from head to toe, what we see is the significant story of crucifixion. There's blood at the top of the head. This person underwent trauma and has probably worn a crown of thorns. His face is significantly beaten, probably from the patibulum, maybe even from excess beating as well. He wears the stripes of many lashings. There's blood flow all the way down his arms as well from the nail itself. He has a wound in his side which exceeds both the blood and the clear fluid from the trauma that his body underwent. We see some of the lashings as well as on the legs, if you didn't notice that before. I forgot that I had this full scale. And then also we see the wounds there at the bottom and how he was fixed. Now, when we look at Jesus' historical death, we have to ask, how is it that Jesus died? And there's many theories on how he would have died. This is taken from an article in which an author had taken all the relevant literature and created a data chart on all the medical examinations and theories and then put them respectively in their categories. So as you can see, most went into asphyxiation, but there's like shock, coagulopathy, suspension trauma, a lot of those things. And so there's a lot of ways Jesus could have died. Let's go over a few of these. The first one being shock. Because of the repeated lashings and the exposed bones and muscles of the individual, the removal of the skin and bleeding, the heavy blood loss, and then finally the blows to the head and the trauma of being nailed to a cross, Jesus went into shock and died. I think part of what may help this case is the significant amount of blood loss, as well as the very reality of the trauma of undergoing that many lashings. And really how you look at the end of it, I mean, you'd look like just a torn up piece of meat. And even scripture attests to this kind of fact. It says, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up. He shall be exalted. Many were astonished at you." And then I underline this: his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance. And then in 53, 4-5, it says, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. We esteemed him stricken, smitten by God and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. And with his wounds we are healed." Long prophesied is the reality of Jesus' many wounds. Asphyxiation, I think, is the one I would probably put my money into, and that seems to be what most scholars do. Asphyxiation is the inability to breathe. Little thing about how crucifixion works. Now, mind you, some of this data comes from people who have volunteered to be crucified themselves, not with nails, but with a horizontal beam and being tied either with ropes or duct tape or something akin to that, and then hanging from that and undergoing the sheer phenomena of the physical position of crucifixion. Now, there is also data coming from Nazi Germany in which Jews were put under this to one German scientist who published his finds. But let me first say this. There's two positions in crucifixions. There is the high position and the low position. When you're in the high position, you are putting your weight on the nails in your feet, which means you have me, big guy here at about 280 pounds. You got about 270 pounds on the weight of these two nails with all the pain receptors and stuff in it. So you're probably going to feel immense pain and scrutiny shooting straight up your legs, and it's going to be on fire, but you're able to breathe. And so you'll be putting your weight on the nails, and you're able to breathe. But you'll probably not have too much time in that position because of how much it hurts, that you'll probably swing back into the low position. So from up here to now down here. The thing about the downward or the slumped position is because of that position. Well, all right, excuse the cut. My camera died, and so we are going to be recording the rest of this now. I can continue to teach this with the PowerPoint slides, and so I will, just to make sure that we have all the data for this section. Well, as I left off, I was talking about the different positions of being crucified. I've just finished up talking about the low position in which, or the high position rather, in which the person is putting their weight on their feet so that they could stand up. And that high position is particularly excruciating because the pain is just shooting up the leg and up the back and up through the thigh. And so a person is deeply, deeply uncomfortable and distressed and in a lot of pain. However, the low position is not that comfortable either. When a person enters into the slump of the low position, so they are now hanging, they're hanging off of their wrists as the nail pierces through the wrist into the cross. And when a person is hanging in that slumped lower position, there's something about this position in which they begin to lose breath. It's a lot harder to breathe in that lower position. And the person is pretty much on a time clock for how long they can last in this position. They're slowly suffocating in this position. And so Roman crucifixion becomes this dance between either supporting yourself up so you can breathe, and your body just feels like it's on fire from all the pain that it's going through, shooting up from the feet. Or you slump down into the lower position in which you're slowly suffocating. That comes with its own pain as you're putting your weight on your wrist as well. But I imagine most people would probably spend a little bit more time in that lower position as they're slowly losing air and then go up for a breath before finally coming back down. A person will faint in the lower position, and these are people who are simply not being crucified with nails, but simply tied to a horizontal beam hanging in the lower position. And what he found was someone can last as little as something like 15 seconds or something like that, all the way up to like a few minutes. And so a healthy person in the crucified lower hanging position is unable to last very long before he passes out or suffocates if you just leave him there. The German doctor even said that he was actually surprised that at one point he would turn around, and then what would feel like the next second he would turn back around to look at the prisoner, and he was already out. In a far more ethical study, using volunteers who were tied to the horizontal beam, they corroborated this data, and that most people didn't last very long. I think that data came out to something around 15 minutes or so. And so what we see here is someone who hangs in the lower position, even as a healthy individual, simply being tied to the horizontal beam, doesn't last very long in this lower position. They're slowly suffocating. They slowly lose that oxygenation in their body and will pass out. So it could be very quickly, or it could take some time. Remembering also that the person in the crucified state in the Roman time could press up on the legs and undergo that extreme pain for some breath. Sometimes crucifixion lasted quite a long time. They were able to get their breath and then come back down, and so this really prolonged the suffering of the individual, but they were able to stay alive a lot longer. And so we have data that some people were able to last a few days or so. Prisoners were meant to be messages to those around, to not be this individual, to not be treasonous to the state. And so it was beneficial for people to be in anguish for a long time to the view of others, so that people will stay in line. But so too can someone die very quickly. If you wanted them to die quickly, you might do something like break their legs or their knees, which we see in the gospel data to expedite the death process. And so by breaking their legs or their knees, taking away the ability to get into that higher position, you could essentially seal the death to anywhere between the next couple of minutes to maybe an hour or so. So what we see here is the crucifixion of an individual is extremely torturous, and neither position is really comfortable. You have to choose either to be in extreme pain and agony or feel like you're being choked. In either way, it's not comfortable, and it is a brutal, brutal process. That's probably why the Romans liked doing it so much. It was so effective in terms of both torture, as well as its message, and then we might even include the execution, not to be left out. Well, how effective is this? I just said that this execution style was very effective, but how effective is it when it comes to the data? Well, when we look at another Josephus account, Josephus in the life of Flavius Josephus, or Vita, he has an entry in which he talks about 3 acquaintances or friends who had been crucified without his knowledge. And so by the time he comes to learn of it, he appeals to Caesar and has them taken off the crosses and provided with the immediate medical attention of the best doctors of the time. Let's go ahead and read this source. It says, "I was sent by Titus Caesar with Cerelius and 1,000 horsemen to a certain village called Theocoa, in order to know whether it would be a place fit for a camp as I came back. Fit for a camp. As I came back, I saw many captives crucified, and remembered 3 of them as my former acquaintance. I was very sorry at this in my mind, and I went with tears in my eyes to Titus, and told him of them. So he immediately commanded them to be taken down, and to have the greatest care taken of them, in order to their recovery. Yet 2 of them died under the physician's hand, while the 3rd recovered." What we see here is, as this land was conquered and many of the captives were crucified, as quickly as Josephus found out about this, he appealed to Caesar with tears in his eyes, saying how they were his friends, and probably they didn't deserve this, and to spare them. And Titus grants the removal of these 3 men with the best physicians at his disposal to bring them to safety, to help them heal, and to help them recover. But what we see is that these three men who were just put on a cross, we don't see anything of flogging or anything like that, but rather three healthy men who were condemned to the cross. Two of them died under the greatest physician hands, having only been enduring the crucifixion for that short time. Immediately they were taken off. And also we see that the third seems to have recovered. We don't know more about whether he fully recovered, whether he died to his injuries later, anything like that. But Josephus does tell us that the third did recover. So what we see here in the data, just from Josephus' account, is that crucifixion is so effective that even someone is healthily put on the cross and then taken off with the immediate care of the best doctors of the time, still you were more likely to die than not. So when we look at the effectiveness of Roman crucifixion, what we see is that it is a very, very, very effective in executing an individual. So as we look once more at the data, the survey of medical practitioners and doctors who have written on the subject, we see that there are various positions in which how Jesus might have died. We've covered shock. We've covered asphyxiation, and we just talked about that now. We covered suspension trauma, and we went over that a little bit just now. We went over coagulopathy. We briefly mentioned the cardiovascular trauma as we talked about the spear going through the side. What we see here is so many scholars have their opinions in how Jesus might have died. And I think that's a big thing, not simply because we're trying to figure out as examiners, based upon the wounds, story, and reason and logic, how someone who has undergone this would have survived, or died rather, how they would have survived up to the point of where they finally died by X. What we see is there's quite a bit of speculation on what would have killed Jesus, but the vast majority of data is certainly that he died. The question is, how did he die? And as we look again once at this chart, we see most scholars, most medical authors and writers who have weighed in on this believe it's asphyxiation. And I would put my hat in that as well. I think the cross and the dance between those, I think that was what probably killed Jesus. And so asphyxiation, I think, is probably my best runner in terms of what killed Jesus. Very, very little scholars there at the bottom, you'll see, have no death. Now, in regards of no death, I think it's extremely unlikely to impossible that this no death would occur. But some people have to, do the long shot. And so we'll read something by D.A. Strauss in his opinion of this no death theory. D.A. Strauss in his A New Life of Jesus says, "For Jesus to somehow creep out of a tomb after having just been beaten and crucified and give his disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life, and the impression which lay at the bottom of their future ministry, this type of resuscitation could by no possibility have changed their sorrow into enthusiasm, have elevated their reverence into worship. In other words, to have been beaten, flogged, and nailed to the cross, if Jesus were to be able to make his way out of the tomb while also bleeding, swelling, and limping, the disciples would not have called Jesus victorious over death, but rather they would have called him a doctor. Nor should one expect that the disciples would have been excited to receive a similar resurrection body. Thus, it is apparent that this theory fails. And I think Absolutely. If Jesus somehow did not die from these wounds, these many wounds, in fact, the ample and overabundance of possibilities and options for him to have died, and I think for many of us, we would have died very much earlier on. But for Jesus to have survived this, and then appeared before his disciples in the state that he was in, surely D.A. Strauss is correct. No one would have worshipped him and said, surely you conquered death. But everyone would have said, call this man a doctor. He's about to die. Well, as we look at the criteria for the data, we see eyewitness testimony in the plethora. We see the dissimilarity of expectation, as no one was expecting Jesus to come back. All the disciples missed it. We see that in the previous lesson of the 12 disciples experienced the bodily risen Jesus. We see the embarrassment, as Paul even says, that many consider the story of Jesus and his crucifixion foolish. Why would you worship a crucified, executed man? And then also we have enemy attestation, as we see in the Babylonian Talmud, in Josephus, and all these other things that say he was indeed crucified. And as someone who was convicted, why would you follow such a person? So we have quite a bit of criteria to see the historical data as a firm foundation of truth. It's with this that I will once again read Bart Ehrman's quote from the beginning as the affirmation that we saw. He says that Jesus died by crucifixion is almost universally attested in our sources, early and late.